The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 346 as amended, the NOTAM Improvement Act of 2023. Just 2 weeks ago, Americans woke to the largest ground stop of aircraft since 9/11 due to the outage of the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA's Notice to Airmen, or Notice to Air Missions, more commonly called the NOTAM system. As a professional pilot, I use the NOTAM system on a regular basis and know firsthand just how important it is to ensure its reliability and how functional it is. This incident highlights a huge vulnerability in our transportation system. And as much as I wish we could say that this incident surprised us, this kind of issue is inevitable. Committee leaders have repeatedly raised the alarm about our woefully out-of-date NOTAM system. The same bill has been introduced and passed 2 Congresses in a row, and multiple laws coming out of the Transportation Committee have demanded that the Department of Transportation and the FAA step up and address the well-known issues with the NOTAM system. What occurred nearly 2 weeks ago is unacceptable, and the American people, they deserve much better. Hopefully this incident was the wake-up call that the DOT and the FAA needed to shake off their ongoing failure to properly maintain our nation's air traffic control system. H.R. 346, as amended, is going to help address this failure by identifying issues with the NOTAM system and proposing solutions to prevent an incident of this magnitude from ever occurring in the future. This bill creates a special task force to improve the utility, the stability, the resiliency, and cybersecurity of the FAA's NOTAM system. Composed of representatives from the airlines, aviation safety experts, and our important aviation stakeholders, the task force is going to review existing NOTAM policies and regulations and the system's overall integrity to determine the best practices to increase the system's efficiency and decrease its susceptibility to outages and which cause other disruptions. Originally, this bill was focused on improving the NOTAM presentation so that pilots and dispatchers could focus on critical information that matters. In 2017, an Air Canada flight nearly landed on a crowded taxiway in San Francisco because the NOTAM informed them of a runway closure, and it was buried on page 8 of 27 pages. We urgently need a better system and a more stable system. And I want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Stauber from Minnesota and Representative DeSalegnier from California, for their leadership and their foresight on this particular piece of legislation. H.R. 346 is good, it's bipartisan, and it's timely in aviation safety. This bill shows that the People's House can rise to the urgent issues of the day. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would support the legislation and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in support of H.R. 346, the NOTAM Improvement Act of 2023, as amended. This bill was introduced by the representative from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, and the representative from California, Mr. DeSalegnier. So on the morning of January 11th, the U.S. airspace came to a standstill when the FAA grounded all airline domestic departures for the first time since September 11th, 2001, due to an agency contractor mistakenly causing an outage of the FAA's NOTAM system. NOTAMs are a critical part of our aviation infrastructure as they provide essential real-time flight safety information, such as potential hazards to pilots, flight dispatchers, and other airspace users. So although the FAA worked to quickly solve the problem and lift the subsequent domestic flight ground stop, the cascading effects of mass delays and cancellations were seen for hours. And I fully support the FAA's actions to ensure the NOTAM outage would not affect the safety of the national airspace system. However, our constituents deserve better. They deserve to have both a safe and reliable national airspace system. The FAA has moved to put several operational and systematic mitigations in place to try and prevent future NOTAM outages from occurring. However, the recent NOTAM system outage shows a clear need to re-examine and modernize the safety-critical systems and legacy infrastructure that flight crews and airline passengers depend upon. To help strengthen the integrity of the system, this bipartisan bill directs the FAA to create a task force on NOTAM improvement to review existing methods for the content and presentation of NOTAMs to pilots, determine best practices to prioritize and disseminate critical flight information to pilots in a way that optimizes review and retention, and develop recommendations to ensure stability, resiliency, and the cybersecurity of the NOTAM system. This task force will be comprised of key aviation stakeholders, including airline pilots, air traffic controllers, air carriers, and aviation safety and computer system experts, among others. And this bill is an important step in a series of efforts Congress and the FAA will undergo to modernize the NOTAM system. And later this week, the Chair and I and other members of this body will be briefed by the FAA Acting Administrator on the status of their preliminary investigation into the NOTAM outage, how the FAA is responding to the incident, and issues that Congress should be considering to further strengthen the NOTAM system. Now, fortunately, we're due for an FAA reauthorization bill this year, giving us an opportunity to build upon the 2018 law and further implement any necessary improvements to safeguard the NAS from similar system outages. The task force created under this bill will play an important role in the FAA's ongoing NOTAM modernization initiative to ensure pilots, flight crews, and other airspace users receive NOTAMs that are timely, relevant, and accurate. There can be no compromises when it comes to safety in the national airspace. As demand for air travel begins to meet and even exceed pre-pandemic levels, this bill will help the FAA and the U.S. aviation industry implement the best practices to improve the safety of the traveling public and the U.S. aviation workforce. So I support this legislation and urge my colleagues to do the same, and with that, reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield such time as he may consume the bill's sponsor, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise in support of my bipartisan legislation that improves the safety of air travel. I would also like to thank my colleague, Mr. DeSaulnier, for his support and leadership on this legislation as well. In 2022, the United States was home to 8 of the top 10 busiest airports in the world. This means that as Americans, we have no room for error when it comes to aviation safety. Although aviation is the safest form of travel, we must always strive to be better. This is why we must address the Notice to Air Emissions, or NOTAM systems. NOTAMs provide current, up-to-the-minute data to pilots on any aspect of their flight. Unfortunately, NOTAMs are often buried in lengthy reports, conflating important safety information with more common alerts. These inefficiencies have the potential to create life-threatening situations, which have just been mentioned. Then on January 11th, 2023, this year, all U.S. domestic flights were grounded for the first time since 9/11. The latest reports from the FAA suggest that the unintentional deletion of files caused this chaos. No one person or one file should be able to take down our whole flight safety system. But the NOTAM system is old and antiquated, so it comes as no real surprise. Unfortunately, leadership at the Department of Transportation is more concerned with woke politics and changing the name of the system rather than appropriate upgrades for aviation safety. Mr. Speaker, I've been advocating for the NOTAM upgrades for 4 years now. My legislation, which creates a task force at the FAA with important input from safety experts and industry professionals to address both efficiency and resiliency of the NOTAM system. And that passed out of the House both in the 116th Congress and in the 117th Congress in a bipartisan fashion, only to die in the Senate. I encourage my colleagues in both the House and the Senate to pass my legislation before another failure of the NOTAM system occurs. Our pilots, crew members, and passengers are counting on us. And Mr. Chair, we do have a change in the 118th Congress. The Transportation and Safety Committee is being led by 2 of my friends. Chairman Sam Graves is ready, able, and willing to change how the committee works and actually put legislation that is good for the American people and good for our transportation. And I had full faith in my good friend, Ranking Member Mr. Larsen, to do the same. We worked together in the past, and I see this committee succeeding with the leadership that I have previously seen by the chair and the ranking member. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Desalegn.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. I also want to thank my partner in this and Chairman Graves for his positive comments. And as he mentioned, in 2017, an Air Canada plane at San Francisco International Airport got within 59 feet of crashing into 4 planes loaded with passengers, putting the lives of more than 1,000 people at risk, which would have been the greatest aviation disaster in American history. When the National Transportation Safety Board investigated, they found that the outdated NOTAM system was the largest part of the near disaster. Since then, I know others have been working with the aviation industry, the FAA, the NTSB, and the Transportation Infrastructure Committee to address the critical issues with NOTAMs. Updating them and making them more accessible to the people who use them is essential to the safety of the flying public and the confidence of the users. Early this month, we learned what happens when there is outage in the system: chaos and grounded flights. In response to the Air Canada incident, I authored the Safe Landings Act, which would work to improve many aspects of aviation safety technology, including this system. And with members of both parties and the ranking member, we have worked over the years, and the chair, to continue to hold the FAA accountable for the safety of passengers, crew, and aircraft. In 2018, we included a requirement that the FAA, in the FAA reauthorization, to speed up the modernization of the NOTAM system. Last year, more than 4 years after the provision passed into law, I led a letter with Ranking Member Larsen to the FAA asking why the system still was outdated. The mass flight cancellations that resulted from the outage further emphasized the need to make rigorous and immediate updates to this system and brought public awareness to this critical system. I'm proud to have worked with my colleague and friend from Minnesota on this bill in a bipartisan manner and look forward to protecting the safety of the flying public. With the creation of this task force, this will be accomplished. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I don't have any more speakers, Mr. Speaker, so I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 346, the NOTAM Improvement Act of 2023. The FAA's Notice to Air System, NOTAM, which sends real-time alerts to pilots about safety conditions, experienced an outage with consequences so far-reaching that it led to nearly more than 10,000 flight delays and more than 1,300 flight cancellations. Even though the cause of the outage bore no connection to a cyber attack, the breakdown in NOTAM alerts nonetheless raises concerns about the cyber vulnerabilities of the antiquated systems that underlie modern air travel. At a time when cyber attacks are rising in both scope and sophistication, modernizing the cybersecurity of air travel must be a priority for the federal government. 20th century air systems will no longer suffice in a world of 21st century cyber challenges. That is why I've written a letter calling on both CISA and DOT to conduct a joint review of the cyber vulnerabilities of all aviation systems, including NOTAM, and that is why I will proudly vote for bipartisan legislation requiring the FAA to establish a task force on NOTAM improvement. With that said, I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve the balance.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as a ranking member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I believe we have to do everything that we can to ensure the U.S. remains the gold standard in aviation safety, and that's why I support H.R. 346 as amended and urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In closing, H.R. 346, as amended, it takes a very important step in ensuring that America's national airspace is going to remain intact, remain operational, and remain safe for the American people. And I again want to thank Mr. Stauber and Mr. Desalegn for their work on this legislation. It's a good bill, and I'd urge all members to support it. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Missouri yields.